Topic of this presentation was actually sold to you all as negotiation is everyone's game. It's something that matters to everybody. We've also got a kind of an alternative title, which is negotiation a man's game, or how to get what you want. And that's because we believe very, very passionately that negotiation is the most important skill in business and in life to get what you want. It's not just negotiating multi-million-pound contracts. It's not about that. And in fact, for many people, they will never negotiate on contracts or major commercial deals. But we do negotiate all the time, every day. And it's that kind of negotiation that we need to think about, because that's the kind of skill that everyone around the world needs. So the short answer to the question, is negotiation a man's game, is no. But that's not the end of the session. We're going to now explore why that's not the case. And I'm going to expose to you some of the common stereotypes that do actually exist around the world about women as negotiators. Now, that is not to say, gentlemen in the room, that this won't be relevant to you, because, of course, the sheer fact that stereotypes exist about women as negotiators tells us that there are also stereotypes that exist about men, and they can be just as damaging as well. So throughout the session, I'll make it relevant to you guys too, but for all you ladies in the room, I hope that this is going to be some insight, not only for you, but also for some of the people that you work with and support throughout your job. Okay, so a little bit about me then. So I'm the founder and CEO of a company called AdvantageSPRING. We do in-house training for big corporates around the world, banks, law firms, manufacturers, media companies. We also do coaching and consulting and advisory for major negotiations. And we will coach people on issues like maybe they're going through a merger and acquisition, maybe they are negotiating a salary, maybe they are negotiating major change in their life. But I don't really want to talk about that side of things today, but I do want to point out to you that we do a lot of pro bono, and we do that because we think it's essential that women in all parts of the world can access this skill. Not everybody has the budget of one of the major investment banks. Not everyone can afford to put their people through expensive training programs. And yet for many of the women that you will be working with, this skill is absolutely essential to them and the success of their family, their business, their community. So we do a lot of pro bono work, and it was actually through our pro bono work with the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women in the UK that we were introduced over to Anna and the team here. A little bit of insight into who we work with, and that's a little bit of insight into the type of people that we are now very proud to support with our pro bono work. Now, let me just tell you, though, about why I even started this company in the first place, because this will give you a bit of insight into some of the attitudes that still exist out there. So my background is essentially, I like to call myself a failed lawyer, in that I did a law degree at university and hated every second of it. I then got offered a job to be a tax attorney, to go and be a tax lawyer. And even after an hour with me this lunchtime, you're going to see I would have been the worst tax lawyer in history. I'm just not that way inclined in how I think or how I act or whatever. So I actually turned down that job in a very corporate law firm, and actually went down to London and started working in public service. So I did a 12-year career, which involved everything from working very locally to divert young people from joining gangs, from being drugs runners, from getting involved in antisocial behaviour and crime. I negotiated multi-million-pound deals for social housing construction in poor areas of London. I negotiated deals for waste management contracts, which was incredibly glamorous. And I actually ended my career advising Boris Johnson, the current mayor of London, on rape, sexual assault and domestic violence policy. So a very broad career in public service. And in that time worked with numerous charities, foundations, trusts, and really kind of spread my wings in that part of public service. In the middle of all of that, I went back to school, trained as a barrister, and after that point, I actually ended up doing a lot more legal advisory work. And it was at that point that I realised that a lot of the people I was working with in government, in local public services, were really brilliant at their day job. They were fantastic at their day job. But when it came to having to negotiate with major private sector companies, because more and more the government was outsourcing its functions, if you put them in front of a commercial negotiator from Microsoft or BT or Oracle or any big corporation, really, they were really struggling to negotiate anything of substance or anything that was solid. So I started to work with people to get them to see how they could negotiate better and how they could be more confident when they were negotiating. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So I was then hired to work for one of my now competitors and was sent around the world for 3 years training people how to negotiate effectively. So think of a big consumer company and I probably train them. So Mars, Coke, Unilever, Tesco, Procter & Gamble, Walmart. And I travelled all over the world doing that. And I was the only woman in the company, which I didn't think was a problem because I kept getting promoted and I was paid good money and I had a good career. And I started to get asked questions by senior women in big corporations. Does gender influence the outcomes we get when we negotiate? And it was a topic I was extremely interested in, so I started to explore it in more detail, and I started to collaborate with some schools over here in the US and back in the UK. And we got a real interest in that particular topic. I then fell pregnant. I went on maternity leave. I came back from maternity leave, and on the 3rd day back from maternity leave, my employers called me into the boardroom, sat me down, and said, "We'd like to talk to you." So I naively thought this was a conversation about bringing me back into the business after being away on maternity leave. And instead, they said to me, "We've been thinking whilst you've been away, and we've decided that as a business, we no longer want to be seen to be doing the woman thing." Yeah. And my first thought was, and this is genuine, my first thought was, who does that? Yeah, who does that? Was my first thought. And then my second thought was, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean by the woman thing. And they said, well, we've decided that actually, you know, upon reflection, you doing all these talks with women's networks and coaching women, we think it's bad for business. And they then went on to say, and we think that people might think that we are a bunch of, and I quote, crazy feminists. Because of course all feminists are crazy. And so I remember sitting there thinking, you've got 2 choices now. Choice number 1 is you're the main breadwinner, you have a 6-month-old baby at home, pretend this never happened. Just pretend it was a silly comment, it didn't mean anything, just carry on as normal. But instead I went for option 2, which was to tell them that I quit, to tell them that I was going to start my own company, go into competition with them, and do the woman thing. And I remember doing that back to them, with no irony attached to it whatsoever. And so they said to me, you won't leave us. So I did. And so that was 3 years ago, and now we work with a great many clients around the world. But we do also very proudly do the woman thing and actively try and come out to rooms like this, work with groups around the world to give people insight into the fact that actually gender can influence the outcomes that we get at the negotiation table. Now, what I actually though have to say very clearly from the start is this is not a session which is going to say that men or women are better than negotiating. You know, no one's better than each other. I actually believe from working all over the world that men and women are just as competent and capable as each other when it comes to negotiating. They both have the skill sets and mannerisms and qualities required to get a good result. But let's not pretend that men and women are exactly the same, because we're not. And also let's not pretend that women and men don't experience different stereotypes, different expectations, different assumptions, different behaviors from people around them. And it's that we're going to be looking at today. So the 6 stereotypes that I'm going to be giving you about women as negotiators today, don't make the mistake of looking at them on the screen and thinking, oh, this is fine, I don't do those things, so I don't need to worry. Because actually, as I'm sure you're well aware, when it comes to stereotypes, it's not always whether you think they apply to you, it's whether the decision makers, the influencers, the senior people around you subconsciously think that they apply to you because you're a woman or because you're a man. So my view is that knowledge is power. And the more we know about the stereotypes that exist, the more we can combat them, the more we can fight them, the more we can overcome them. And the more we can then start to encourage the people around us to do the same as well. So that's a little bit about me and my background. This is why I believe this is so important. So I'm really glad you're all here to do the woman thing today. So let's crack on and do it. So why is negotiation important? We need to just reflect on that a little bit. So up on the screen behind me, I've got a diagram that represents some of the chances and opportunities that we will have to negotiate on a daily, weekly, monthly, or annual basis. Now, interestingly, we don't always realise that we could be negotiating, should be negotiating, or indeed how to do it well. And I'm hoping that by the end of this session, we'll have a bit more insight into that. But if you look at this diagram here, and you're in the middle of it, those are just some of the opportunities that we have. Some are more obvious than others. So we negotiate with our colleagues. We negotiate in relation to workload, who's going to go downstairs and pay for the coffee, who's going to get the window seat. We negotiate with our boss in relation to job title, annual leave, maternity leave, salary, whatever else. But we also negotiate in our personal lives. So I've put there, we negotiate with our other halves. So I know that I wake up most mornings, turn around to my husband, Chris, and say, if you walk the dog, I'll get our son ready for nursery. And I tend to say that on very cold, wet and windy mornings. And in London, there are lots of them. So that's a very frequent trade that we do. Now, the important phrase when I actually say that to him is, if you, then I. If you do this for me, then I can do this for you. And I'm telling you right now, that is the most powerful phrase in negotiation. Because it's the one way that you can ensure that you just don't keep giving and giving and giving and giving and never getting anything back in return. So from my perspective, when I say that to my husband, I'm trying to get him to understand that I'm not going to do everything for him. You know what? It's a bit of give and take. He's got to do something for me too. And interestingly, we will use that phrase very frequently in our personal lives with friends and family. The problem is we then don't bring that into the workplace enough. And we should, when we're negotiating with partners or colleagues or suppliers, anyone, we should be using that phrase. I've actually got some bits and pieces for you to take away afterwards. These are copies of the articles we've had on various different sites and in various publications. Some of them will touch on some of these points, so by all means take them away. If there aren't enough, Anna, we'll send you the electronic link as well. You can put them on your site. But we also negotiate, going back to this, with our wider family. So I know around August every year I start the annual negotiations with my mother-in-law about where we're spending the holidays that year. Since I had my first son, that's become quite a challenge, I have to say. And that leads me on very nicely to children. So I don't know how many of you have children in the room, but I have a 3-year-old boy called Leo. He is possibly the most amazing negotiator I have ever met. I would love to say it's because I taught him, but it's not. It's because children are naturally amazing at negotiating. Why is that? Well, it's quite simple, that up until about the age of 8 or 9 or 10, children don't care that much about what you might think about them. And so when they negotiate, they will do whatever it takes to get the result. So for my 3-year-old son, Leo, his whatever it takes normally involves throwing things on the floor, stamping his feet, screaming, no, 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 and then actually chucking himself on the floor as well for good measure. Now, I have to say that that tends to be pretty effective for him, particularly if we're in a public place. It tends to work very, very well. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting the next time you go and negotiate with your line manager, you throw yourself on the floor and start screaming. That's not good. But one of the things that we come across the world over, in both men and women actually, is a lot of people have this obsession with whether or not people like them. Are they going to like me if I do this? Are they going to like me if I push hard on this point? And for some people, that desire and need to be liked and that fear of not being liked is so strong that they don't push for the best result. They always walk away with a second-rate outcome. And actually, the thing I always say to the people that we work with is, actually, I'm not saying you should actively try and not be liked in the world of work. But my test is always, would I rather be liked or respected? Now, ideally, I'd like to have both. But if I had to pick one, I'd go for being respected. So actually what we should be learning from children is sometimes we need to focus less on the being liked, more on the being respected, and more on actually doing what we need to do to get the result. Just don't go throwing yourself on the floor. Anna, if that starts to happen, I apologise in advance. Okay, other obvious negotiations then are negotiations that we might have with contractors, service providers, customers, clients, partners, other organisations that we work with, colleagues, they're obvious ones. But the negotiation that we often neglect, and yet the negotiation that can often have the most impact for us in our daily lives, is the negotiation that we constantly have with ourselves. So I am referring to the little voice in your head. Now, every single one of us has a little voice in our head. Don't sit there thinking you don't have one, because you do. It's just for some of us, it's louder than it is for others. For some people, they've learned to control it, other people haven't. The reason this little voice is important is because it tends to speak to us when we least want it or need it to. It tends to pipe up in moments of crisis, in moments of anxiety, when we're under a lot of pressure. And to give you a really kind of basic example, imagine someone was preparing to go and negotiate their salary. And they'd done all their preparation, they'd done all their planning, and they went to speak to their boss. They knew exactly what they were going to say. But then right as they sat down, nerves kicked in a bit, and just as they're about to open their mouth, something in their head said to them, don't ask for that much, they're going to think you're greedy, drop it, drop it, drop it. And so they do. And we see that being exhibited again and again and again and again on the workshops that we run. And it's not just on salary, it's on any discussion where you feel any kind of emotional attachment. So we need to be aware of the voice in our head. Now, I'm conscious that I don't have long enough to talk too much about it, but if you know this is an issue for you, this article is one that was on the Huffington Post recently. Do grab a copy of it. We'll send them out to you as well. And it gives you 5 top tips to turn that very negative voice into a positive one. But what we often say is that is also a negotiation. That is something you need to plan for. That is something you need to have dealt with before you get to the negotiation table. So the point with all of this is that we negotiate all the time. It's something we do every day. And yet, many people hate negotiation. They find it awkward, uncomfortable, embarrassing, time-consuming, cringeworthy. Pick a negative word. A lot of people associate that with negotiation. Of course, there are the people who love it and just go for it and really find it quite exhilarating. But I would say about 80% of the people we work with really don't like it that much. And they get a knotted feeling, a twisted feeling of anxiety in their stomach whenever they know they're going to have to sit down and negotiate something. Now, as a result of this, a lot of people will try and avoid negotiation. So we will routinely hear people say things like, you know what, just cut to the chase and give me your best offer. Or, you know what, I don't want to waste your time here, so this is what we can do. And people do that because they think that it's going to build transparency and trust, and that it's going to help the negotiation. It's going to help the long-term relationship. But often it has the completely opposite effect. So up on the screen behind me, I've got a still from a video clip, which unfortunately we couldn't send it over, but I'm going to urge you to go and have a look at it. Go on to YouTube, have a look at the Monty Python haggling clip. You have probably seen it. If you haven't, I do urge you to go and have a look at it. It's a fantastic clip, but it makes the point that actually people like to be given the chance to try and get the best deal they can for themselves. And if you deprive them of that chance, they're not going to thank you for it. Because if something is too easy, people will start to wonder why. Have you ever heard the old phrase, never look a gift horse in the mouth? Yeah? The thing is, we do. If something's handed to us on a plate, something will start in our heads going, hang on a minute, why is that so easy? What's going on here? It's kind of like if I was going to buy a house, let's say it was on the market for £400,000 in the UK. Let's imagine that I had the budget in place, I went along and had a look at the house, I loved the house, and so I decided to make an offer to the seller directly. And I go up to the seller and I say, look, I love the house, it's great, I'm going to make you an offer, and the offer I'm going to make you is £340,000. And imagine he looks at me and he says, thank you very much, you've got a deal. Nice doing business with you. I get in the car, I drive home, what am I thinking? Yeah, what's wrong with it? Is the foundations dodgy? Is the roof about to fall off? Are the neighbours from hell? Was it overpriced? What's wrong with it? Now, some of you might be sat there thinking, I'm not thinking that. I'm thinking I've just got the house of my dreams for loads of money under the asking price. So what's not to like? Well, trust me when I tell you that you might think that, but only for about 12 to 18 hours. And 12 to 18 hours later, when you're having your cup of coffee with your breakfast the next day, that little voice in your head I was telling you about, it will kick in and it will start saying exactly what some of you just said. That was very easy, wasn't it? Maybe there was something about the house I'm not sure about. Maybe he's completely led me astray here. Have I been shafted? What's going on? You will start to think like that. Why? As I've said already, if something's too easy, we'll start to wonder why. And people value the things they work hard for. Do you know what? Negotiation is part of human DNA. We have been doing it since the dawn of civilization. It's in our blood. It's what allows societies to exist, countries to cooperate, marriages to fail or not, relationships to survive or not. It's what keeps things moving. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. But what we can do is start to deal with our discomfort when we have to do it. But do you know what? If you deprive someone of their chance to negotiate, ultimately their little voice will kick in, and that's when any agreement starts to become vulnerable. Okay. So let's go on to the slightly controversial bit, shall we? So I've headlined this bit, is it a man's game? Now in this, we've got 6 common stereotypes, although 2 of them have been put together just to keep it tighter and we can move through it a bit quicker. So the stereotypes that there are, women don't ask. The second part of that one is, and when we do, we don't aim high enough. Stereotype number 2 is we don't like changing character. Stereotype number 3 is women don't like to say no and are too concerned with being liked. Number 4 is that women are far more effective at negotiating for others than they are for themselves. And stereotype number 5 is that women are too collaborative and they can't do the tough stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these stereotypes in turn. We are going to explore it, test its validity, look at any research that might have backed it up, and then we're going to give you a couple of tips to try and make sure that you don't fall victim to that stereotype, and hopefully you can start to educate the people around you who might be falling into these stereotypes on how not to do that. Now, I'm happy to take questions at the end, but if you don't want to ask questions, because often negotiation is quite an emotive topic, it's often quite personal to people, I'm happy to stick around as well and speak to people one-on-one. So let's go through this. Happy to get your views as we go through, and we're going to get you negotiating as well. You're not just going to get to sit there. I'm going to give you another chance to flex your negotiation muscle. Okay, now before we crack on then with this, I just want to show you something. You could view this as quite depressing or just quite hilarious. I'm not sure what your view is going to be. But at the start of this year, I went on Google Images. There are, of course, other imaging websites. And I typed in female negotiators. And those are the top 2 images that came up. So, and I'm not even joking, those are the top 2 images that came up. So the first one is, I'm terrified, I don't know what I'm doing, someone help me, anyone help me. And the second one is, I'm a total bitch. It's kind of like if you type in a businesswoman to a lot of search engines, the images that come up tend to be white women in black skirt suits wearing boxing gloves, because of course we all carry boxing gloves in our purses to work every day. So like I said, I don't know if that's just something we should laugh at, or actually if it's just a little bit of insight into some of the stereotypes and views that do exist about women at the negotiation table. So let's take the first stereotype then. Women don't ask, and when we do, we don't aim high enough. So there on the screen is the book Women Don't Ask by Linda Babcock, and it's a fantastic book. It's probably the seminal text on gender and negotiation. So if you've done any reading on this topic, you've probably read that book. And it's a really good book because it's got lots of different pieces of research in it that just really help us to understand why some of these stereotypes might exist. Now, I say it's the seminal text on gender and negotiation. That is until March next year when my book comes out. And then that's... The point is that this is a really good book that you should, if you can, get hold of, because it will not only shock you, but it'll hopefully inspire you to try and encourage change as well. But I've taken just a couple of bits out of this book. I'll just say right now, though, this kind of survey or this kind of study that I'm going to quote to you here today, there are so many more examples that I could have used. These are just 3 that I plucked out quite easily, but they're, you know, if you want to challenge any of these, I could replace them with 3 more, 3 more, 3 more. Unfortunately, there's a lot of research to back up this stuff. So first one is called the starting salary study. And again, I'm going to summarize it for the purposes of today, but basically what happened is researchers went onto college campuses across the US and they recruited male and female students who were about to graduate, go out into the world of work and look for their first job. And upon being offered their starting salary, they would then track what the outcome was. And what they discovered is, upon being offered their starting salary, only 7% of women would negotiate and try and get a higher amount, whereas 57% of men would naturally negotiate to try and get a higher amount. Now, 15 years ago when this research was done, that equated to a $4,000 difference in starting salaries between men and women. That's now being refreshed, and I believe it's now about $18,500 baseline difference. What I think is shocking, though, is that over a 30-year career, that baseline difference can equate to nearly $1 million difference between men and women and their overall earnings when you factor in pension payments, bonuses, other benefits. Now, unfortunately, that was also compounded by something called the Boggle research. So did any of you play Boggle when you were younger, a board game? So in this particular piece of research, the team went onto campuses in the US and recruited students by saying, we will give you between $3 and $10 if you play a game of Boggle with us. And of course, the students said yes, because it's free money. And they sat down and they played the game of Boggle with them. Now, at the end, the researcher routinely offered everybody $3. And what the researchers observed is that in that situation, the male students were 9 times more likely than the female students to push back and say, hang on a minute, you said between 3 and 10. I want 10. Whereas the women went, oh, $3, thank you. And off they went. Now, to give you a non-financial example as well, so a sporting example, over a 7-year period in the US Open Tennis Championships, researchers observed that female players were 80% less likely to dispute a close line call than male players in a similar situation, which of course would then go on to have a knock-on effect as to the outcome of the game. Now, like I said, it's quite a depressing slide, isn't it, really? Like I said, there's actually a lot more pieces of research that I could have given you there. There's a lot you could do in extra reading there. The tip has to be surely just ask. Because if we're not even putting ourselves at the negotiation table, what are we missing out on? What opportunities are we depriving ourselves of? What value are we leaving behind for ourselves? Now, interestingly, I did a session very similar to this in London recently, and there was probably about 200 women in the room, and I said, my tip has to be just ask. And one woman stood up and she said, I disagree with you. And I said, why is that? And she said, because if you were that woman who's always asking for more, who's always kind of speaking up, you'll be viewed as difficult. People won't like working with you and you'll be penalised. And then she went on to say, and you know what? You've got to start believing in karma. Because if you work hard, people will notice and you will be rewarded. That shocked me, I have to say, somewhat, because actually my view is that good things do not always come to those that wait and wait and wait and wait. We actually have to take control. We have to take charge. We have to start to ask for ourselves, because actually there isn't always going to be someone to do it for you. Now, of course, I recognise that around the world and in different industries, there are difficulties and challenges in people doing that. And yes, women are penalised if they're assertive and if they ask out too much. But my view is do we just accept the status quo and therefore never ask, never put ourselves forward, or do we start to challenge it? I know what I would prefer. It's not going to change overnight, but if we're not asking at all, if we're not even getting to the negotiation table, you know, we're always going to be held back. Now, my view is I always ask the question, go to the negotiation table. If you do, what's the worst that could happen? Well, often for many people, the worst thing that can happen is someone says no. For many people, no is a terrifying word, and it signals the absolute end of that interaction. What we always say is, you know what, if you hear the word no, simply view it as a springboard for exploring what could be possible. Hear no, and then take that as your signal to ask questions, explore further, present something else, suggest something, you know, that's different. Because actually the worst that can happen if you don't get to the negotiation table at all is you start to miss out on money, opportunity, security, any number of things. So yes, it's uncomfortable, but if we're not getting to the negotiation table at all, we can't start to influence outcomes for ourselves or for anyone else. Now, the second part of that stereotype is when we do negotiate, we're not ambitious enough. We don't aim high enough. Now, that book up there on the screen is The Confidence Code, and it's a fantastic book written by Katty Kay and Claire Shipman. I'm going to do it a huge disservice by actually summarising it in one sentence. And basically, this book tells us that women have lower levels of confidence than men, basically. The book's got a lot more in it than that, but for the purposes of today, that's basically what it says. Now, how does that manifest itself then in the world of negotiation? Well, in my world, this idea of women having lower levels of confidence tends to manifest itself in lower female performance in ambiguous negotiation scenarios. So what do I mean by an ambiguous negotiation scenario? That's a situation where maybe it's not 100% clear whether or not we should be negotiating. Maybe there's no hard and fast rule about whether you do negotiate on that point. So it might be on your terms and conditions of your employment, for example. Or in some industries, it might be, say, on bonuses. The point is, some people will get offered their terms and conditions and just say, all right, thank you very much. Other people will automatically schedule an appointment with HR to try and negotiate it. Now, the point is that in those situations, number one, women tend not to negotiate at all. And number two, when they do, they're not ambitious enough in what they ask for. And we've got lots of research that shows us that if a woman asks for that much, a man routinely would ask for that much. And then as a result, they end up walking away with more as an average. Now, that might explain research in the UK in 2013 that showed the Chartered Management Institute found that male middle managers and on average, and this was across a number of industries, £141,000 more in bonuses over a 30-year career than female middle managers that perform to the same level. Now, my response to this is always the same. It's, does this figure exist because women are routinely discriminated against and offered lower bonuses? Or is part of the reason it exists because women aren't negotiating to try and get more? It's probably a combination of the two. I don't have the absolute answer to that, but I do think we need to think about how we can empower women, particularly, to actually try and make the most of the situation that they're in. And I also just want to point out the Reddit approach as something we need to be aware of. So I'm sure, particularly over here, you guys are very familiar with Ellen Pao, now ex-interim CEO of Reddit. Ellen Pao recently did an interview for the Wall Street Journal where she explained that she was banning salary negotiations. You may have read about this. And when she was asked by the Wall Street Journal, why are you banning the salary negotiations at Reddit? Her response was, well, we all know that women can't negotiate as well as men. And so that then results in them getting worse outcomes in their salary negotiations. So to create a level playing field and to promote gender equality, we are cancelling and wiping out salary negotiations. Now, my immediate response to this is I'm not sure that's the best way to encourage gender equality within an organisation, because it surely just merely reinforces the stereotype that women can't negotiate. My view is you've got to then say to yourself, well, where do you draw the line? Because if you're saying that women can't negotiate and therefore we should cancel salary negotiations and not let them, don't expose the poor things to the salary negotiations because they can't do it, do you then say, and actually whilst we're at it, women probably shouldn't go and negotiate with partners or customers or suppliers because they won't be able to negotiate the contracts very well? And do we then go on to say, and actually you should probably actually not have them managing teams because they won't be able to negotiate on behalf of their staff? I think it's a very dangerous precedent to set. But when I wrote a piece on this on LinkedIn, 50% of the people who commented on my article said, no, we're 100% behind Ellen Pao. We think this sets the right example. Whereas another 50% were saying, absolutely not, we agree with you. This is not a good example to be setting. So again, it's just something to think about. Actually, by taking these things away, does it solve the problem? Or actually, should we be looking at creating a situation where women can negotiate, they're empowered in how to do it, they're confident in how to do it, and also they're not operating in situations where maybe there's lots of biases that hold them back anyway. So my tip has to be this. You know what, when it comes to negotiating, of course, do your research, know your market, know your value, know your situation, know exactly what's going on for that negotiation. Of course, that's a given. But you know what, open extreme. So if you were going to ask for this much money for a project, ask for this much. If you were going to ask for this to be your deadline, in fact, ask for this much. Because the guys are doing it, and they seem to be getting pretty good results out of it as well. So be a bit more ambitious in what you ask for, because you might be surprised at what they might be willing to agree to. Okay, number 2, women don't like changing character. Now, one of the things that we teach people is that negotiations look very different. So I've said to you already that most people don't go out there and negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts. You know, I'm sure many of you don't necessarily do that. And actually, many of the people that we train won't negotiate on money at all. They will negotiate on deadline, on policy, on risk, on perspective, on a whole range of different other things. Number of people on a project, geography. They'll negotiate on lots of things. It might not be money. The point is, though, that not all negotiations are the same. They often require different approaches, different behaviours, different strategies. And we need to be able to flex and adapt our style to get the best result each time. So in some negotiations, we'll have to be a bit tougher than we might be in other ones, where we have to be more collaborative. That's just fairly commonsensical. Problem is what the research tells us is that women have a problem with flexing and changing their style. They don't like the idea, apparently, of having to be tough sometimes because they find it disingenuous or lacking in authenticity. Now, my response to this research is what a load of rubbish, basically. And the reason I say that is because I actually believe women have, for decades, had to play many, many different roles in order to survive and thrive in business, around the world, in their personal lives and their professional lives. So we've got a jacket up there on the screen, because the advice and the mantra that we always live by is you need to put on your jacket and play the appropriate role. And if you feel uncomfortable playing the tough guy, you know what? Put on your jacket, feel that you can play that role for a time, then take off that jacket and go back to being you. There's nothing disingenuous about that. It's just good business sense. It's just good working sense. And in fact, I'll give you myself as an example for this. So over the course of a couple of weeks, I have to play many different versions of myself. So, for example, the Natalie that went for a glass of wine with her best friend, hadn't seen her for ages, and we drank maybe a bit too much. That Natalie was very different to the Natalie who was in France the other week, negotiating with a pilots union and had to negotiate really tough, really aggressive. That Natalie was very different to the Natalie who's up at 3 a.m. every morning at the moment, because that's apparently when my 3-year-old wants to get up. And that Natalie is very different to the Natalie stood here talking to you today. But they're all still Natalie. I never stopped being Natalie. I just played a slightly different version of myself each time. And I think what we need to recognise is there is nothing wrong with that. But women apparently do have this idea that to do that is not authentic. It's not particularly transparent, and it's misleading. And really what I would say to you is, as long as you do it credibly and professionally and to the right level, I don't think there's anything wrong with having to be a slightly different version of yourself in order to get through your day job. Stereotype number 3 then. So stereotype number 3 about women as negotiators is that women don't like to say no, and we are excessively concerned with being liked. Now, I have to say, this is one of the stereotypes that we get a lot of people recognizing, if not in themselves, certainly in some of the people that they might work with or beneficiaries of projects that they work on. So what research tells us again and again and again, and there's lots that back this up, is that women are actually generally more concerned with perception than the guys are. And I've picked out an old piece of research here, but it's so depressing. I think we just have to, actually explore it. And that is, in 1998, Rudman did some research where, it's a very big piece of research, but the basic outcome of this research study is that people don't like assertive women. That was basically the stark finding. So you guys will be more than familiar with the assertive-aggressive dilemma, which is that an assertive man is assertive and an assertive woman is often viewed as aggressive. Now, maybe we could think that, 1998, that was actually a while ago now, so maybe things have moved on. Well, unfortunately, in 2013, Breskel, who is a psychologist based out of Yale, did some research looking at this again. And what Breskel's team did is they went and recruited male CEOs and female CEOs from lots of different sized companies. And what they did is they gave each of those CEOs a script. And in that script, it was basically them being assertive in a speech, right? And what they were told to do is to go and do that speech in front of a group of selected employees. So the male CEOs went and did the speech, the female CEOs went and did the speech, and afterwards the researchers went and spoke to the employees to get their views about how do you feel about your CEO after watching them being assertive. Now, the employees of the male CEO fed back that when he was being assertive, he was powerful, inspiring, and a leader. You know where this is going, right? When the employees of the female CEO were asked, what did you think of your CEO when she was being assertive? The words that came back were annoying, bitchy, irritating, aggressive. Now, that part of the research, quite depressingly, doesn't shock me at all. I'm not surprised by that on any level. What I was surprised, though, was when I read on in the research paper and discovered that the employees in every single situation were a 50-50 split of men and women. Mm-hmm. The point being that female employees penalised assertive women just as much, if not more, than the male employees. Mm-hmm. And my point actually here is that, unfortunately, we need to start challenging ourselves as well, because there is a tendency to say that this is a problem created by men, and men penalise the women for behaving in a certain way, but ladies, we are just as responsible. And actually there is a lot of evidence that shows that women will often penalise assertive women just as much. Now, I wrote a piece on the Huffington Post called Negotiating Gender Bias, and I actually posed a question to the reader, which was, have you ever, as a woman, watched an assertive woman on stage or listened to an assertive woman speak and just quietly in your head thought, oh, she's a bit much, isn't she? Or she's a bit of a bitch, or anything like that? We probably don't want to admit it, but we probably have thought that at one point or another in our lives. And actually, there's a lot of women who I lecture and talk to who will say, yeah, I have. The point here is that actually this assertive-aggressive dynamic is never going to go away until women start to challenge their own viewpoints on other women. Yes, we need to challenge the guys too, but we have a responsibility to challenge ourselves just as much. And actually, what organisations like yours help to break things on a societal level. You help to make societal change. But we also all have an individual responsibility to challenge ourselves, the people around us, to teach our children and our young people that it's not acceptable to categorise men and women in this way. I actually think the Ban Bossy campaign is a fabulous example of how we can start to change views around children. So it's this idea, obviously, that bossiness is a word that's only ever applied to young girls. So were any of you here ever called bossy as a child? Yeah. I was called bossy as a child constantly, and I have two younger brothers who are just like me in every way. But they are the first ones to say they were never called bossy, they were called confident. They were called powerful, whatever else it might be. So we do need to think about actually how some of these very deep-rooted societal views need to be challenged. And in certain countries in the world, I think we know this is an even bigger issue. That in some countries in the world, it's even harder for women to be assertive. And I've just actually come back from a trip to Asia, and I had a long chat with many women in that room. Did a session for the Hong Kong Women's Foundation. And they were coming up to me afterwards and saying, you know what, we have a double bind here, that actually, yes, we're female, but societally we're not expected or encouraged to be the assertive ones. So, different parts of the world will have different challenges, but I think it's certainly something we all need to deal with. Now, do I have the answer to this? I think if I did, I would probably be president or something. So, unfortunately, I don't. But actually, if you take anything away from today, maybe think about how we can challenge ourselves and the people around us to maybe stop this assertive-aggressive dilemma continuing and continuing and continuing. Second part of that stereotype is this fear of no. Women don't like to say no. So again, stereotypes tell us, and research backs it up, that women are more reluctant to say no than men are. And apparently this is because we have a fear of alienating people or appearing unreasonable, maybe linked to this assertive-aggressive dilemma. We don't want to be the woman who keeps saying no, who's seen as a ball breaker or whatever else people might term assertive women as. Now, in my world, this manifests itself in a stereotype that women will capitulate more quickly at the negotiation table than men, i.e. we will back down more quickly because we don't want to keep saying no and no and no and no. Now, I've got two bits of advice, and it works for different people who have a different mindset on this. So the first thing I would say is that we can recognise that no is a complete sentence. But often what we do is we feel so uncomfortable about saying no that we say no, and then we keep talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and apologise and apologise. And then by the time we actually stop talking, we've completely diluted the rejection that was just made. So we can recognise that no is a complete sentence, and often we will say to delegates on our workshop, try saying no and then shutting up. It's tough, but just try it and see what the outcome is. But if you really struggle with that, then try saying no differently. So rather than just saying no, don't, won't, or can't, instead, why don't you soften it a little bit? And instead of saying that, saying, you know what, that's not going to work for me, but what I could do is. So you're not just saying no, you're offering a solution as well. And that makes everybody feel that bit more like they're winning. Okay. Stereotype number 4 or 5, however you want to look at it. We are more effective at negotiating for others. Now, this is probably one of the most entrenched and well understood stereotypes about female negotiators. It's this idea that when we're negotiating for something for ourselves, we don't go as hard as if we were negotiating for other people. And, you know, there's so much research on this. And actually, I always think it's probably indicative of why there are so many great female litigators out there in the world. This whole kind of stereotype of a mum fighting for her kids or for her family. You know, women, if they're representing others, tend to go in harder, tend to fight harder. The lady point there on the screen is Professor Margaret Neal from Stanford University. She's done loads of research on deal making and gender. She's fabulous, and she's done various bits of research that show that in the US, female governors, legislators, anyone in a position of power, they will routinely secure higher financial settlements for the people they represent than their male counterparts. And then research that was done with Harvard shows that female executives routinely secure higher bonuses in certain industries for their teams than male executives do. Now, Professor Neal provides some advice on how to deal with this, because her view is look, if we're not very good at negotiating for ourselves, but we're pretty good, in fact, we're very good at negotiating for others, why don't we use that to our advantage? So what she says is, next time you negotiate, use it. So I've actually called this the husband, horses and chickens advice, which is she's written in one of her articles that every time she goes to negotiate something with the dean of her university, she will tell herself before she goes in there, look, Margaret, at home you've got a husband, 3 sons, 4 daughters, 5 dogs, 3 cats, 6 chickens and a mortgage to pay. You better get a good result. Now, interestingly, Dr. Lois Frankel, who wrote the book Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office, she tweeted me a number of months ago now saying that she completely disagrees with Professor Neal's advice. And she says, actually, Professor Neal's advice only serves to reinforce the idea that a woman's worth or a woman's value is only ever decided by the people around her. And actually what we should be doing, to coin a well-known advertising phrase, is recognising that we are worth it, and go into every negotiation recognising that we are worth advocating for. Now, that's not to undermine the advice of Professor Neal, because I know for a fact that for some women, Professor Neal's advice really helps them. But I know that for some women, they do feel that it undermines them a bit, so they prefer Lois Frankel's advice. So whichever one works for you, use it. But unfortunately, the stereotypes in the research does illustrate and suggest very strongly that we do perform better when we're negotiating on behalf of other people. Now, in your world, that actually works very, very well for you. Think about how you can use it. Think about how it applies to you. And then finally, women are too collaborative and we can't do the tough stuff. Now, once again, I think this is a load of rubbish, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, some of you might be looking at the screen and might be starting to work out why I think this is a load of rubbish. So before I go on to this image, I'm going to talk to you about the BEM sectoral inventory. So the BEM sectoral inventory, you may well be familiar with it. I'm going to do, again, a huge disservice by summarising it massively. But basically, it was an exercise whereby different characteristics were assigned to the genders, basically. And in summary, you can see that the characteristics of women, of females, is that we are collaborative, understanding and empathetic. And generally, guys, you're better at the tough stuff. Okay, that's the that's the assumption that's out there. Now, my response in relation to negotiation is firstly to think about the mythical fixed pie bias. I know that sounds crazy and a bit weird, basically what I'm saying to you is, how often are negotiations one-off, tough, aggressive, butting of the head type exercises? Kind of like what you just did then with the necklace case. How often do the negotiations you do look like that? Not very often. Because actually most negotiations that we have to do in the world of work or in our personal lives, they're a bit more complicated than that. There's more things to think about. There's a relationship to maintain. We've got to be a bit more creative. They're a bit more long-term in nature. More people might be involved. There's a lot more riding on it. And actually, it's those types of negotiations that actually require more creativity, more innovation, and a more collaborative approach. So my view is this. Actually, ladies in the room, if we are naturally that good at the collaborative stuff, well, that's great news for us. Because they're actually the types of negotiations that we have to do far more frequently. And that's then a good thing, because that then actually makes us all-rounders. Because my view is, ladies in the room, that you are more than capable of doing the tough stuff. In fact, it comes very, very naturally to every single one of you. It's in your DNA. Human beings are competitive. We've had to be to survive and thrive as a species. So what I want you to take away from today is that actually, yes, you can learn the process and you can learn the theory, but ultimately negotiation is not just about facts, numbers, statistics, trends, precedents. It's not just about that. It's about people. And negotiation is as much about how we interact, react, behave, view each other, test each other, perceive each other, how far we can push each other, be pushed, how confident we feel. And that stuff can make all the difference. So 2 final bits of advice to you, ladies. My first bit of advice to you is, and I apologise in advance, this is a little bit cheeky, gorilla balls. Bear with me. So gorilla balls, let me break that down into 2 parts for you. So the first part is gorilla, and what I'm actually referring to is gorilla syndrome. Now, gorilla syndrome is something that happens for men and women. And it's basically this phenomenon. I said it right. I can never say that word. It's that thing. It's a phenomenon. I can't say it now. Basically, gorilla syndrome is something that happens when men and women are told that something is a skill of the opposite gender. Gorilla syndrome kicks in, and we puff out our chest, bang on our chest, and go outperform the men or the women every time. So, for example, ladies, if someone tells you that negotiation is a man's skill, that it is a man's game, let them, because then gorilla syndrome will kick in and you'll go and outperform the men every time, or vice versa to the gents in the room. And the second bit of that advice is balls. But I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here, because what I really mean is confidence. But gorilla confidence doesn't get the same smile as gorilla balls, I have to say. Confidence. And the reason I say confidence is because you know what? Negotiation is uncomfortable. It can be difficult, it can be awkward, it can be time-consuming. And actually, to do it well takes real confidence. But what I would say is that is true if you are a man or if you are a woman. It applies to everybody. And I'll leave you with this. There are 3 simple rules in life. Number 1, if you do not go after what you want, you will never have it. If you do not ask, the answer will always be no. And if you do not step forward, you will always be in the same place. Contact details. I'm happy for tweets, any connections on LinkedIn, any questions that you've got. If there are any questions, I'll take them now and I'll stick around to talk to anyone afterwards. But thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.